Spring of 1943. A mathematician who'd never flown in combat, never fired a gun in anger, never even seen the inside of a bomber, sat in a cramped office at 401 West 118th Street in Manhattan and drew a conclusion that would save more American lives than most battlefield commanders. Abraham Wald stared at the data scattered across his desk. Charts showing bullet hole distributions on returning B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators. Diagrams mapping damage patterns across wings, fuselages, tail sections, and engines. The officers from the Army Air Forces had been clear about what they wanted. Tell us where to add armor. Tell us how to bring more crews home. The answer seemed obvious to everyone except Wald. He saw what the others missed, not in the data itself, but in what the data couldn't show, the holes that weren't there, the planes that never came back, and in that absence, he found the answer that would alter the mathematics of survival for every bomber crew flying over Germany. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem had been growing impossible to ignore since August 17, 1942, when the first American heavy bombers crossed the English Channel to strike targets in occupied France. Those early missions against the marshalling yards at Rouen had gone well enough. 18 B-17s flew to the target, 18 came back, but as the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into Reich airspace through autumn and winter, the casualty rates began telling a story that contradicted every assumption about modern aerial warfare. By early 1943, the numbers had become brutal. Missions over Germany were resulting in loss rates that sometimes exceeded 5%. Simple arithmetic made the implications clear. A bomber crew was required to complete 25 missions to finish their tour. If you lost 5% per mission, the odds of any individual crew surviving to completion were approximately 1 in 4. Some missions were far worse. The raid on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, would see 60 B-17s shot down out of 291 dispatched, over 20% losses in a single day. The bombers were supposed to be flying fortresses. The name itself suggested invulnerability. Boeing had designed the B-17 to absorb punishment and keep flying. Early combat reports seemed to validate the concept. Bombers returned from missions looking like flying cheese graters, peppered with holes, yet still airworthy. But by mid-1943, a disturbing pattern emerged that nobody wanted to discuss openly. Planes weren't just getting shot down by concentrated fighter attacks or catastrophic flak hits. They were disappearing from single points of failure, one hit in the wrong spot, and a bomber worth $200,000 and carrying 10 trained airmen would simply drop out of formation and spiral toward Earth. Something was killing B-17s and B-24s that shouldn't have been fatal. The 8th Air Force brass knew they needed answers, but the answers wouldn't come from pilots or engineers. They needed mathematicians. The Statistical Research Group had been established at Columbia University in July 1942 under the direction of W. Allen Wallace. It was classified, but not secret in the Manhattan Project sense. The work involved applied mathematics rather than atomic physics. The weapons being developed were equations instead of explosives. The mission was to harness American mathematical talent for the war effort in ways that could save lives and resources. The roster of minds assembled in that Morningside Heights building read like a preview of post-war academic achievement. Milton Friedman, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Economics, worked down the hall. George Stigler, another future Nobel laureate, occupied an adjacent office. But the brightest mind in the entire operation, the one colleagues turned to when problems seemed unsolvable, was Abraham Wald. Wald's path to that Manhattan office had been neither straightforward nor easy. Born October 31, 1902, in Kolosvar, Transylvania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary, he'd grown up in a deeply religious Jewish family. His parents homeschooled him because attending school on Saturdays violated Jewish law, and the Hungarian school system at that time required Saturday attendance. His mother and father proved more than capable as teachers. Wald's mathematical gifts emerged early. By 1928, He'd graduated from King Ferdinand I University with a degree in mathematics. 3 years later, he completed his doctorate at the University of Vienna. His dissertation examined geometry and mathematical economics. Colleagues recognized immediately that Wald possessed an unusual combination of abstract theoretical capability and practical problem-solving instinct. He could move between pure mathematics and real-world applications with a fluidity that was rare. But academic brilliance meant nothing in Vienna in the 1930s if you were Jewish. Despite his doctorate and growing reputation, Wald couldn't secure a university position in Austria. The rising tide of anti-Semitism had already begun closing doors. He worked as a tutor and took odd jobs, supplementing income however he could, all while continuing his mathematical research in whatever spare time remained. March 1938 brought the Anschluss. Nazi Germany annexed Austria. For Jews, the implications were immediately clear. Wald needed to leave. Through a combination of professional connections and fortunate timing, he secured an offer from the Cowles Commission for Research in Economics at Yale University in the United States. He and his family fled Austria in 1938, just as the full machinery of Nazi persecution was beginning to crush Jewish life in Central Europe. In America, Wald found both safety and opportunity. He moved to Columbia University, where he taught statistics and continued developing his mathematical theories. When war came to the United States after Pearl Harbor, Wald volunteered his expertise. The Statistical Research Group recruited him almost immediately. His background made him technically an enemy alien, Hungarian-born, with roots in now hostile territory. Officially, he wasn't supposed to see the classified reports he generated. The joke around the SRG offices was that secretaries had to pull each page of his calculations out of his hands the moment he finished writing, whisking away documents he wasn't authorized to read. But nobody questioned his value. When the Army Air Forces came to the Statistical Research Group in early 1943 with their bomber survival problem, it was Wald who took the lead on finding answers. The data the military provided was extensive. After each bombing mission, ground crews meticulously documented damage to returning aircraft. They recorded the location of every bullet hole, every piece of shrapnel damage, every structural failure. The information was compiled into comprehensive databases showing exactly where German fighters and flak batteries were hitting American bombers. The pattern was clear and consistent. The fuselage took the most hits, approximately 1.7 bullet holes per square foot of surface area. The wings weren't far behind. Fuel system components showed similar damage density, but the engines showed notably fewer hits, roughly 1.1 holes per square foot. The tail section also showed lower damage concentration. To the military officers analyzing this data, the conclusion seemed self-evident. Armor should be added to the areas taking the most hits. The fuselage housed the crew and vital systems. It was getting hammered. Therefore, reinforce the fuselage. The logic appeared unassailable. Wald reviewed the same data and came to the opposite conclusion. He recommended adding armor not to the fuselage, but to the engines and other areas, showing the least damage on returning aircraft. The officers thought he was insane, or at minimum, that he'd misunderstood the assignment. They'd come to statisticians for help optimizing armor placement. Wald was telling them to put armor where the bullets apparently weren't hitting. How did that make any sense? Wald's explanation was simple, but it required a fundamental shift in perspective. The data you're analyzing, he told them, comes exclusively from aircraft that survived their missions and returned to base. You're not seeing the complete picture, you're only seeing the survivors. The concept he was articulating would later be formalized as survivorship bias, though Wald himself never used that particular term. The principle was straightforward once you understood it. When you examine only successful cases, you're inherently blind to the failure modes that prevented other cases from being observable. Think of it this way, Wald explained. Assume for a moment that German fire hits American bombers randomly. Shells and bullets don't preferentially seek out one part of the aircraft over another. They hit wherever they hit. If that's true, then every section of the aircraft should show roughly equal damage density when you sample enough planes. But that's not what the data shows. The data shows heavy damage to fuselages and wings, but much less to engines. What explains that discrepancy? One possibility is that German gunners are specifically avoiding engines, but that's absurd. The other possibility, the correct possibility, is that planes hit in the engines don't make it back to be counted in your sample. A bomber can take substantial damage to the fuselage and still fly. You can punch holes through non-critical sections of the wings and the aircraft remains airworthy. Hydraulic lines can be rerouted. Crew members can plug leaks. The plane limps home, but if you take out an engine, especially on a B-17 where you only have 4 to begin with, the aircraft's chances of making it across the English Channel drop precipitously. Lose 2 engines and you're almost certainly going down. The fuselage damage you're seeing on returning aircraft, Wald continued, represents proof that fuselage damage is survivable. Those holes you're counting are evidence that this part of the aircraft can absorb punishment. The absence of engine damage on returning planes is evidence that engine damage is fatal. Therefore, armor belongs on the engines. It belongs on the areas that show the least battle damage in your sample, because those are the areas where a hit means the aircraft doesn't come home at all. The mathematical foundation of Wald's argument was more complex than this simple explanation. He produced a series of technical memoranda, 8 in total, working out the probability distributions and developing methods to estimate vulnerability across different aircraft sections. His approach involved creating theoretical models that accounted for both the aircraft that returned and those that didn't. He used what limited data existed about crashed bombers and combined it with the damage patterns from survivors to build a more complete picture. The work was rigorous, full of equations and probability theory that required genuine mathematical sophistication to follow. But the core insight, the idea that was about to save thousands of lives, could be stated in plain English. Put the armor where the bullets aren't, because that's where they matter most. The military accepted Wald's recommendation. Implementation began in mid to late 1943. Boeing and other manufacturers started producing engine nacelle armor, additional protective plating around engine components. Existing aircraft in the field received retrofit modifications. The changes added weight, roughly 200 pounds per aircraft, depending on the specific configuration, but the performance penalty was deemed acceptable given the potential reduction in losses. Testing the effectiveness of Wald's recommendations under actual combat conditions took time. You couldn't simply compare loss rates before and after in a clean, controlled experiment. Too many variables affected survival. Fighter escort improved dramatically with the introduction of long-range P-51 Mustangs in late 1943. Tactics evolved. German defences shifted. Pilot experience varied. Isolating the specific contribution of improved armour placement from all these other factors required careful statistical work. But by early 1944, patterns were emerging in the casualty data that suggested Wald had been correct. Bombers with additional engine protection were returning from missions at higher rates than those without. Particularly telling were cases where aircraft took hits to armoured engine components that likely would have caused engine failure without that protection. Maintenance crews found shrapnel embedded in engine armour that had stopped short of reaching critical components. Those were bomber crews that came home because a mathematician in Manhattan had asked the right question about missing bullet holes. The full scale of Wald's contribution is difficult to quantify precisely. How do you count lives saved by preventing losses that would have occurred but didn't? The statistical analysis conducted after the war suggested that improved armour placement contributed to measurably reduced loss rates, but teasing apart exact numbers requires assumptions about what would have happened in a counterfactual scenario where Wald's recommendations hadn't been implemented. What's certain is that the principle he established, looking for what's missing rather than just what's present, became fundamental to operational research. His approach to the bomber survival problem represented one of the earliest successful applications of systematic data analysis to military decision-making. The techniques he developed for estimating vulnerability distributions based on incomplete data were used not just for the remainder of World War II, but in subsequent conflicts in Korea and Vietnam. Modern aircraft design still incorporates lessons learned from Wald's work. Vulnerability assessments for military aircraft routinely account for survivorship bias. Engineers designing protective systems understand that you must consider not just where damage is observed, but where damage is fatal enough to prevent observation. The Manhattan office where Wald worked through these problems no longer exists as it was. The building at 401 West 118th Street now houses Columbia University faculty apartments. No plaque commemorates the lives saved by equations written there. But in the history of applied mathematics, few examples demonstrate more clearly how abstract thinking can produce concrete results that matter in the most literal sense possible. Wald continued his work with the Statistical Research Group through the end of the war. His contributions extended beyond the bomber armor problem. He developed sequential analysis techniques that improved quality control in munitions production. He worked on optimal ammunition loading for fighter aircraft. He advised on sampling methods for testing artillery shells. Each project demonstrated the same core capability, taking complex real-world problems and finding the mathematical framework that revealed solutions. When the war ended, Wald returned to academic life. He joined the faculty at Columbia University full-time, focusing on theoretical statistics and decision theory. His textbook on sequential analysis, published in 1947, became a standard reference. Students who studied under him remembered a man who combined intellectual rigor with genuine humility, who could work through the most abstract mathematical proofs, but never lost sight of practical applications. Tragically, Wald's life ended in 1950 when the Air India flight carrying him and his wife crashed in the Nilgiri Mountains of southern India. He'd been travelling on an extensive lecture tour at the invitation of the Indian government, sharing his expertise with statisticians and researchers across the country. He was 47 years old. The irony of dying in an aircraft accident wasn't lost on those who knew his wartime work. The man whose mathematical insights had improved bomber survival died when his own plane went down. But the methods he'd developed, the ways of thinking he'd pioneered, continued long after his death. Reading through those memoranda now, you can see the progression of Wald's thinking. The first memo, dated June 1943, laid out the basic problem and proposed a mathematical framework for analysis. Subsequent memos refined the approach, addressed specific questions from military officers, and extended the methods to cover different aircraft types and damage scenarios. The mathematics is dense, full of probability distributions and derivations that require serious statistical background to follow completely. But interspersed with the equations are moments of almost conversational clarity, where Wald explains his reasoning in plain language. He understood that his military audience, however intelligent, didn't all have advanced mathematical training. He needed to communicate not just what his calculations showed, but why his approach was correct and the intuitive approach was wrong. One particularly effective explanation used a thought experiment. Imagine, Wald wrote, that you could set the probability of engine damage being fatal to 100%. Every plane hit in the engine goes down. None return. Now look at your damage data from returning planes. You'd see zero engine damage, not because engines aren't being hit, but because planes with engine damage aren't in your sample. The absence of engine damage in your data would be proof that engines are the most vulnerable area, not the least. Now, relax that assumption. Allow some planes with engine damage to return, but fewer than those with fuselage damage. You'd expect to see some engine hits in your data, but fewer than random chance would predict if all damage were equally survivable. Which is exactly what the actual data showed. The thought experiment made the logic crystal clear. It transformed an abstract statistical argument into something military officers could grasp intuitively. That combination of rigorous mathematical analysis and clear communication was characteristic of Wald's work throughout his career. The impact of his bomber armor recommendations extended beyond immediate lives saved. The success of his analysis demonstrated The value of operational research to skeptical military commanders. Before the war, most generals and admirals relied on experience, intuition, and established doctrine. The idea that mathematicians and statisticians could contribute meaningfully to tactical and strategic decisions was novel. Wald's work, along with other successes from the Statistical Research Group and similar organizations, helped establish operational research as a legitimate military discipline. After the war, all branches of the American military created dedicated operational research divisions. They hired mathematicians, statisticians, and analysts to study everything from logistics optimization to weapons effectiveness. The approach spread to other NATO militaries and eventually became standard practice worldwide. Modern military organizations now routinely employ quantitative analysis for decision-making in ways that would have been unthinkable before World War II. Wald himself never sought recognition for his wartime contributions. He viewed the work as his duty, his way of contributing to the fight against fascism that had driven him from his homeland. When colleagues later tried to highlight his role in saving bomber crews, he deflected credit, noting that he'd simply applied standard statistical methods to the problem presented. He wasn't being falsely modest. To Wald, the mathematics was straightforward. The military had given him data and asked for analysis. He'd provided it. That others had missed the survivorship bias issue wasn't something he took particular pride in correcting. It was just what the numbers showed if you thought carefully about what your sample represented. That lack of ego, combined with genuine brilliance, made Wald an ideal colleague. Other members of the Statistical Research Group remembered him as someone who listened carefully to problems, thought deeply before responding, and explained his reasoning patiently, even when his conclusions contradicted. Conventional wisdom. He never made anyone feel stupid for not seeing what he saw. He simply showed them what he'd found and explained why it mattered. The graduate students Wald, mentored at Columbia after the war, absorbed not just his mathematical techniques, but his approach to problem solving. Start with careful definition of what you're trying to learn. Question your assumptions, especially the implicit ones you don't realize you're making. Consider what your data can and cannot tell you. Think about selection effects and sampling bias. Use mathematics to make your reasoning rigorous, but don't hide behind equations. Communicate clearly so non-specialists can understand why your conclusions matter. Those principles, distilled from Wald's practice rather than explicitly stated as rules, influenced a generation of statisticians who went on to their own distinguished careers. The ripple effects of his teaching extended far beyond the specific problems he worked on personally. The story of Abraham Wald and the missing bullet holes has taken on a life of its own in the decades since his death. It's been retold countless times in business books, statistics, textbooks, and management seminars. The details have been simplified, sometimes altered, occasionally embellished. Some versions claim Wald worked for the Navy rather than the Army Air Forces. Others suggest he produced dramatic visualizations of aircraft with missing bullet holes, though no evidence exists that he ever created such diagrams. The popular retellings often compress the timeline, making it seem like Wald had a single eureka moment rather than developing his analysis through months of careful work. But the core truth remains powerful, regardless of how the story gets retold. A mathematician saw what others missed. He questioned the obvious interpretation of clear data. He recognized that absence of evidence was itself evidence when properly understood, and that insight saved lives. The question of how many lives specifically is one historians and statisticians have debated. Without Wald's recommendations, would bomber losses have continued at the rate seen in early 1943? Would they have gotten worse as German defences improved? Or would other factors, better fighter escort, improved tactics, declining Luftwaffe capability, have driven down loss rates regardless? Conservative estimates suggest that improved armour placement contributed to saving several hundred bomber crews over the course of the war. More aggressive analyses, accounting for compound effects as crew experience accumulated and missions continued, push the number into the thousands. The exact figure is ultimately unknowable. You cannot run a controlled experiment on history. But what's certain is that the direction Wald pointed was correct, and following that direction produced measurable improvements in survival rates. The broader lesson extends beyond bombers and armour. Wald's analysis of WWII survivorship bias fundamentally changed how researchers and analysts approach data in fields far removed from military operations. Medical researchers studying disease outcomes now routinely account for patients lost to follow-up. Financial analysts examining investment performance adjust for funds that closed due to poor results. Safety engineers analyzing accident data consider near misses that didn't result in crashes. In each case, the principle is the same. Your sample is incomplete. The cases you can observe may not be representative of all cases. The missing data might be the most important data. These insights, obvious once stated but easy to miss in practice, trace directly back to Wald's work in 1943. The Statistical Research Group itself became legendary in the history of operational research. The roster of talent assembled in that Manhattan building reads like a who's who of 20th century quantitative analysis. Beyond Wald, Friedman, and Stigler, the group included Harold Hotelling, W. Allen Wallace, Leonard Savage, Frederick Mostella, and dozens of other mathematicians and statisticians who went on to shape their respective fields. The problems they tackled ranged from the strategic to the mundane: optimal bombing patterns, sequential sampling for quality control in artillery shell production, the best altitude for anti-aircraft fire, how to arrange convoy escorts to minimize submarine attacks. Some of their work involved elegant mathematics. Other projects required grinding through tedious calculations on mechanical calculators, operated by teams of young women recruited from colleges across the Northeast. But all of it shared a common purpose: using quantitative methods to improve the Allied war effort. The success of the Statistical Research Group convinced military leadership that this approach had value. By the time the war ended, operational research had proven itself as a discipline. Universities began offering dedicated programs. Corporations hired operations researchers to optimize their business processes. Governments established agencies devoted to policy analysis. Modern decision science, with all its sophisticated tools and methods, owes a debt to those mathematicians working in cramped Manhattan offices during World War II. They demonstrated that careful analysis could answer questions that intuition got wrong. That data, properly interpreted, could guide decisions better than experience alone. That mathematical thinking applied to real-world problems could save lives and win wars. Abraham Wald didn't live to see the full flowering of the field he helped establish. His death in 1950 cut short a career that surely would have produced further contributions. But in the 7 years between his bomber armor work and his death, he'd already secured his place in the history of statistics and operational research. His 1947 book, Sequential Analysis, laid out the mathematical foundations for a technique that became fundamental to quality control, medical trials, and countless other applications. The method allows researchers to make decisions based on accumulating data rather than waiting for a fixed sample size. You can stop a trial early if the results are clear, saving time and resources. Or you can extend data collection if initial results are ambiguous. The flexibility improves efficiency without sacrificing statistical rigor. Wald's work on decision theory, developed primarily after the war, provided mathematical frameworks for choosing between alternatives under uncertainty. The concepts he formalized influenced fields from economics to engineering. His contributions to geometry, though less well known outside specialist circles, advanced understanding of metric spaces and geometric probability. But it's the bomber armor problem that captured popular imagination, perhaps because the stakes were so clear. Lives hung in the balance. The conventional wisdom was wrong. One person's insight made the difference. It's a story with a clear hero, obvious villains in the form of German flak batteries, and a satisfying resolution where careful thinking triumphs over assumptions. The reality, as always, was messier. Wald didn't work alone. Other members of the Statistical Research Group contributed to the analysis. Military officers provided essential context about aircraft operations and German tactics. Engineers determined what armor configurations were feasible given weight and manufacturing constraints. Testing the recommendations in combat involved thousands of bomber crews whose experiences provided the feedback loop that validated Wald's conclusions. But Wald was the one who saw the fundamental flaw in the initial approach. He asked the critical question that reframed the entire problem. Without that insight, the collaborative effort that followed might never have happened. The armor might have been placed on fuselages, providing protection against survivable damage while leaving engines vulnerable to catastrophic failure. The counterfactual haunts any serious analysis of Wald's contribution. How many crews would have died if his recommendations hadn't been implemented? How many missions would have failed? Would the strategic bombing campaign have been forced to change its tactics, perhaps reducing effectiveness? The questions multiply, each one speculative, none answerable with certainty. What we know is this. Starting in mid-1943, bomber crews began receiving better protection in critical areas. Loss rates, while still terrible, trended downward as multiple factors improved. Engine armor was one factor among many, but maintenance records show numerous instances of aircraft returning with damaged armor that had stopped projectiles short of vital components. Those documented saves represent real crews who came home, real men who survived to see war's end. The mathematics of survival shifted in ways both large and small. A crew's odds of completing their 25-mission tour improved from roughly 1 in 4 to nearly 1 in 3 by late 1944. That doesn't sound dramatic until you multiply it across thousands of crews. Hundreds of additional men survived who would have been lost under the earlier odds. Some of those survivors went on to notable post-war careers. Others lived quiet lives, working ordinary jobs, raising families, never speaking much about the war. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren live now, generations removed from the conflict, mostly unaware that their existence traces back in part to decisions made in a Manhattan office by a mathematician they've never heard of. That's how history works most of the time. The visible heroes, the generals and presidents and pilots, get remembered. The unseen contributors, the analysts and planners and problem solvers working behind the scenes, fade from public consciousness. Abraham Wald is known among statisticians and operational researchers. His name appears in textbooks and academic papers, but ask a random person about World War II contributions and you'll hear about Eisenhower and Patton and Doolittle, not about the mathematician who figured out where to put armor on bombers. Perhaps that's fitting. Wald himself never sought acclaim. He did his job, applied his skills where they were needed, and moved on to the next problem. The recognition he received during his lifetime came from academic peers who understood the significance of his work. That was enough for him. But 7 decades later, as we look back on the war and try to understand how it was won, Wald's contribution deserves remembering, not just for the specific problem he solved, though that mattered enormously to the crews who benefited, but for what his approach represented: a willingness to question obvious conclusions, a commitment to following data wherever it led, even when that meant contradicting experienced officers and accepted wisdom, an understanding that the right question matters more than quick answers. The military officers who initially questioned his recommendations came to appreciate this quality. Once they understood his logic, they became advocates for implementing his suggestions. They recognized that Wald's analysis, precisely because it challenged their assumptions, was more likely to be correct than analysis that simply confirmed what they already believed. This dynamic, where the most valuable expert advice often contradicts conventional wisdom, remains relevant. Organizations seeking outside analysis frequently hope consultants will validate existing plans. When experts instead recommend radical changes, the first instinct is often defensive resistance. Wald's success in overcoming that resistance, through clear reasoning and solid mathematics, provides a model for how experts can influence decisions even when their conclusions are unwelcome. The key was never to claim special authority based on credentials or position. Wald didn't tell military officers that they were wrong and he was right because he was a mathematician. Instead, he showed them his reasoning. He walked them through the logic step by step. He helped them see what he saw so they could reach the same conclusion independently rather than accepting it on faith. That pedagogical approach, treating disagreement as an opportunity for explanation rather than a battle to be won, served Wald well throughout his career. His students and colleagues remembered that he never made them feel inferior for not understanding something immediately. He'd patiently explain concepts from multiple angles until comprehension clicked. The goal was shared understanding, not demonstrating his own brilliance. In the case of bomber armor, shared understanding was essential. Wald's recommendations would only save lives if they were actually implemented. Implementation required buy-in from military leadership, engineers, production facilities, and ultimately bomber crews who'd be flying with the modified aircraft. Each group needed to understand why the changes mattered. Wald's clear explanations made that possible. The contrast with other wartime scientific programs is instructive. The Manhattan Project succeeded through a combination of brilliant physics and tight security. Most of the people working on atomic bomb development didn't understand the full picture. Compartmentalization kept information restricted to those who absolutely needed to know. The approach worked for building a weapon, but it wasn't a model for how to conduct operational research. Operational research, to be effective, required widespread understanding. You needed military commanders to trust the analysis enough to change tactics. You needed production facilities to prioritize recommended modifications. You needed crews to accept and use equipment based on statistical recommendations. All of that depended on explanation and persuasion, not just calculation and secrecy. Wald and the Statistical Research Group operated in a middle ground between complete openness and total compartmentalization. Their work was classified, but not deeply secret. Military partners could discuss recommendations and push back on conclusions. The mathematical details remained technical, but the essential logic was made accessible to non-specialists. This balance between rigor and communication proved essential for translating analysis into action. The impact went beyond immediate tactical improvements. By demonstrating that mathematicians could contribute meaningfully to military decisions, the Statistical Research Group changed institutional culture. After the war, every military branch established operations research divisions. Defense contractors hired quantitative analysts. Strategic planning incorporated statistical modeling. A revolution in how military organizations make decisions flowed, directly from wartime successes like Wald's bomber armor analysis. Similar transformations occurred in civilian sectors. Corporations began hiring operations researchers to optimize supply chains, production schedules, and resource allocation. Governments created policy analysis offices staffed with economists and statisticians. Hospitals used quantitative methods to improve patient flow and treatment protocols. The professionalization of decision-making through quantitative analysis became a defining feature of post-war institutional development. Wald didn't live to see most of these developments. His death in 1950 came too early. But his work, particularly the bomber armor analysis, served as a canonical example of why quantitative thinking mattered. Students learning operations research decades later would study Wald's approach as a fundamental case. The lesson was clear. Data is essential, but understanding what data means, especially what it doesn't include, matters even more. Modern data science, with its emphasis on big datasets and machine learning algorithms, sometimes loses sight of this lesson. The temptation when you have massive amounts of data is to assume that selection bias doesn't matter much. With millions of data points, surely any sampling issues wash out, but survivorship bias doesn't disappear with scale. If your data collection process systematically excludes certain cases, having more data just means having more biased data. The solution Wald demonstrated remains relevant. Think carefully about your data-generating process. Ask who or what is missing from your sample. Consider whether the cases you can observe differ systematically from cases you can't observe. Adjust your analysis accordingly. These steps require thought and domain knowledge, not just computational power. In an era where artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making increasingly shape outcomes, Wald's emphasis on understanding your data becomes even more critical. Algorithms trained on biased data will encode that bias into their predictions. Systems optimized for observable outcomes will miss important dynamics in unobservable cases. The mathematics might be far more sophisticated than what Wald used in 1943, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. You must think carefully about what your data represents and what it doesn't. The bomber armor problem had the advantage of clarity. The goal was obvious: bring more crews home. The data was concrete, bullet holes in specific locations. The stakes were visible: real bombers with real men flying real missions. That combination made it easier to think rigorously about what the data meant. In many modern applications, goals are murkier, data is messier, and stakes are less immediate. But the need for careful analysis hasn't diminished. If anything, it's more important in domains where errors are less visible and consequences are more diffuse. Wald's approach, questioning assumptions, considering missing data, using mathematics to formalize intuition, provides a template that scales beyond any specific application. Every analyst facing a difficult problem can benefit from asking, what am I not seeing? What cases are missing from my sample? What would happen if I assumed the opposite of the obvious conclusion? These questions, properly pursued, often reveal insights that superficial analysis would miss. The cost of missing those insights varies. In Wald's case, the cost would have been measured in bomber crews lost to preventable engine failures. In other domains, the cost might be medical patients harmed by treatments optimized for survivors, investment losses from strategies that ignore selection bias, or policy failures from programs evaluated without accounting for attrition. The specific consequences differ, but the pattern is consistent. Survivorship bias, left unaddressed, leads to poor decisions. Recognizing the bias is the first step. Correcting for it requires additional work. Wald developed mathematical techniques for estimating vulnerability in unobserved cases based on patterns in observed data. His methods were sophisticated for their time and remain instructive today. But the conceptual leap, understanding that you need to correct for selection bias in the first place, matters more than any specific technical approach. Once you recognize the problem, solutions become possible. Without that recognition, you'll optimize for the wrong objective using biased data and wonder why your results disappoint. The wonder of Wald's contribution is how obvious it seems in retrospect. Of course, you should put armor where planes are getting shot down, not where returning planes show damage. Once explained, the logic is crystal clear. Yet experienced military officers, looking at the same data, reached the opposite conclusion. They weren't stupid. They weren't ignoring evidence. They simply failed to ask the right question about what their sample represented. That failure is instructive precisely because it's so understandable. When faced with data showing clear patterns, the natural response is to take those patterns at face value. Bullet holes concentrated in fuselages means fuselages need protection. The reasoning seems airtight until someone points out that you're only seeing planes that survived. Then the entire analysis flips. How many other problems involve similar reversals? How many apparently obvious conclusions rest on unexamined assumptions about sample composition? These questions should haunt anyone working with data or making decisions based on observed patterns. The world is full of subtle selection effects that bias what we can see toward unrepresentative cases. Wald's lasting gift wasn't just solving one specific problem, it was demonstrating a way of thinking that applies across countless domains. Every statistician who checks for survivorship bias in their analysis, every researcher who worries about missing data, every analyst who questions whether their sample is representative, their continuing work Wald began in wartime Manhattan. The bomber crews who benefited from his recommendations mostly never knew his name. They flew their missions, fought their war, came home when the fighting ended. Some may have noticed that newer aircraft seemed more robust, that engine damage was less frequently fatal, but they wouldn't have connected that improvement to a mathematician they'd never met working in an office they'd never seen. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.